The cold wind bit through Jacob's ragged coat as he huddled near the entrance of a gas station, his fingers numb from the night's chill. It had been another long day of rejection, of people pretending he didn't exist. He was used to the sidelong glances, the way passers-by clutched their bags tighter when they walked past him. He was invisible, just another homeless man lost in the city's unforgiving streets. Jacob wasn't always like this. There was a time when he had a job, a home, and even a family. But life had a way of breaking even the strongest men. A series of misfortunes, losing his job, a car accident that buried him in debt, and a sickness that drained what little he had left, had led him here. Now, all he had was the change in his pocket and the tattered clothes on his back. That morning, Jacob counted the last of his money, one crumpled dollar bill and a few coins. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a cheap cup of coffee, something to warm him up before another long day of searching for food and shelter. He sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth, and prepared to step inside the gas station. Just then, a man stumbled toward him, shivering, his clothes soaked from the rain that had poured the night before. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't eaten in days. His hands trembled as he rubbed his arms for warmth, and his eyes, tired, sunken, carried the weight of despair. Jacob recognized that look. He had seen it in his own reflection too many times. The man hesitated, as if ashamed to speak, but finally muttered, "Sir, I hate to ask, but do you have anything? Even $1? I need to eat." Jacob swallowed hard, glancing down at the bill in his hand. It was all he had left. If he gave it away, he would have nothing. No coffee, no warmth, no comfort, even for a moment. But then he looked back at the man, at the hunger in his eyes, at the way he shivered in his drenched clothes. Jacob knew that kind of suffering, and he couldn't ignore it. Without a second thought, he reached out and pressed the crumpled dollar into the man's trembling hand. "Here," Jacob said, forcing a small smile. "Get yourself something warm, all right?" The man's eyes widened, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. His lips parted, but no words came. Finally, his voice broke with emotion. You don't even have anything yourself." Jacob shrugged. "I'll manage, just take it." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the exchange hanging between them. Then, with a grateful nod, the man whispered, "Thank you," before disappearing into the store. Jacob sighed, pulling his coat tighter around himself. He had nothing now, not a single cent. But strangely, his heart felt full. Little did he know, the man he had just helped was not just another homeless stranger. He was someone whose life was built on wealth, power, and influence, and his decision to give away his last dollar would soon change everything. Jacob sat on the cold pavement outside the gas station, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He had nothing left, not $1, not a coin, not even the promise of a meal. But strangely, he felt lighter. Giving away his last bit of money should have made him feel more desperate, but instead, he felt human. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath as he tried to push away the hunger gnawing at his stomach. The city bustled around him, people walking past without a second glance. Life moved on, indifferent to the struggles of a homeless man. A few minutes later, the stranger returned. Jacob almost didn't recognize him at first. His face was no longer twisted in desperation, and his hands had stopped shaking. In one hand, he held a steaming cup of coffee, and in the other, a bag of food. He knelt down in front of Jacob, offering both with a small, hesitant smile. "Here," the man said, his voice softer now. "I got this for you." Jacob blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though the aroma of the coffee made his stomach ache with longing. "I know," the man replied, "but you didn't have to help me either." Jacob hesitated for a moment before accepting the coffee, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. He took a careful sip, letting it chase away the chill inside him. The man handed him the bag next, and when Jacob opened it, he found a sandwich inside. His mouth watered at the sight, but he forced himself to take slow, measured bites, savoring each one. The stranger sat beside him on the sidewalk, watching him eat in silence for a moment before speaking again. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his tone unreadable. You had nothing left. Jacob swallowed his bite and shrugged. I know what it feels like to have no one, he admitted. I couldn't just ignore you. The man studied him for a moment as if seeing him in a new light. Then he extended his hand. I'm David. Jacob wiped his hand on his coat before shaking it. Jacob. David's grip was firm, his eyes searching Jacob's face as if trying to understand something deeper. Finally, he nodded. You're a good man, Jacob. Jacob huffed out a small, dry laugh. I don't know about that. David didn't argue, but there was something in his expression, something knowing. They sat together for a while, sipping coffee in the early morning light, two strangers bound by an act of kindness. What Jacob didn't know was that David was no ordinary man. He wasn't homeless, and he wasn't just another person down on his luck. He was a billionaire, disguised in rags, testing the world around him, and Jacob had just done something that very few ever had. He had passed a test he didn't even know he was taking. Jacob finished the last bite of his sandwich, feeling the warmth spread through his body. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in days. He glanced at David, who sat beside him on the pavement, sipping his own coffee like they were just two old friends sharing a morning break. There was something different about him, something Jacob couldn't quite put his finger on. So, Jacob said, breaking the silence. What's your story? David exhaled slowly, staring at the passing cars for a moment before answering. It's complicated. Jacob chuckled dryly. Yeah, life usually is. David turned to him then, his eyes unreadable. If I told you that I wasn't really homeless, that I was actually someone with more money than I know what to do with, what would you say? Jacob raised an eyebrow. I'd say that's the weirdest joke I've heard all week. David smirked, shaking his head. It's not a joke. Jacob frowned, looking him over. His clothes were filthy, his face unshaven, his hands rough with the wear of someone who had spent too many nights on the street. If he was a rich man, he was doing a damn good job of hiding it. All right, Jacob said, playing along. If you're some big-shot millionaire, what are you doing out here dressed like this? David hesitated, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Billionaire, he corrected quietly. Jacob nearly choked on his coffee. Excuse me? I'm a billionaire, David repeated, his voice calm, measured. David Reynolds. Jacob's mind blanked for a moment. That name, it rang a bell. He had seen it in newspapers, heard it on the news. David Reynolds was one of the richest men in the country, a self-made entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing. And now, he was sitting beside Jacob on the cold concrete like they were equals. Jacob stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but David's face remained serious. You're messing with me, Jacob said, shaking his head. There's no way. David pulled something from his pocket, a worn, creased business card. He handed it to Jacob, who hesitated before taking it. The moment his eyes landed on the gold-embossed lettering, his breath caught in his throat. David Reynolds, CEO, Reynolds Industries. Jacob looked back up at him, stunned. Why would you pretend to be homeless? David sighed, glancing away. I wanted to see the world from a different perspective, he admitted. To understand what it's like when you have nothing. To see if people still have kindness in their hearts when they think there's nothing in it for them. He met Jacob's gaze. And you gave away your last dollar without hesitation. Jacob's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. David smiled, but there was something deeper in his expression, something almost sad. You have no idea how rare that is. Jacob swallowed hard. He had spent years feeling like a failure, like the world had chewed him up and spat him out. But now, sitting here, hearing this from a man who had everything, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Pride. David took a deep breath, as if making a decision. Jacob, I want to help you. Jacob stiffened. He wasn't sure what that meant, but something told him his life was about to change forever. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, gripping the business card in his hands. He had spent years struggling, learning not to trust promises that sounded too good to be true. People had offered help before. Empty words, fleeting sympathy, but nothing ever changed. "I don't need charity," Jacob muttered, his voice rough. David studied him for a moment before responding. "I'm not offering charity, I'm offering a chance." Jacob scoffed. "A chance at what?" David leaned forward, his expression serious. "A fresh start." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. A fresh start. Jacob had dreamed of one for so long it felt like a fantasy, something people like him didn't get. The world didn't care about men who had lost everything. "What's the catch?" Jacob asked, narrowing his eyes. David chuckled, shaking his head. "No catch. You helped me when you had nothing. You didn't ask for anything in return. That's exactly why I want to help you." Jacob clenched his jaw. It all felt too easy, too unreal. "Why me?" David's expression softened. "Because people like you deserve more than this." Jacob swallowed hard, emotions knotting in his chest. He wanted to believe David, but hope was dangerous. He had learned that the hard way. Still, what did he have to lose? With a deep breath, he finally asked, "What kind of fresh start are we talking about?" David smiled. "A job, a place to stay, a real chance to rebuild your life." Jacob stared at him, stunned. A job? A home? It was everything he had convinced himself he could never have again. "You don't even know me," Jacob whispered. "Why would you do this?" David's eyes darkened with something unspoken. "Because once, a long time ago, someone did the same for me." Jacob blinked, caught off guard by the confession. There was something in David's voice, a hint of pain, of a past he wasn't ready to share. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something stir inside him. Hope, real, tangible hope. He took a shaky breath. "Where do we start?" David grinned, standing up and offering Jacob his hand. "First, let's get you out of the cold." Jacob hesitated for only a second before reaching out and taking it. For the first time in years, someone had reached for him, not to push him away, not to ignore him, but to lift him up, and Jacob wasn't going to let go. Jacob sat in the passenger seat of David's sleek black car, gripping the edge of his ragged coat as if it might disappear at any moment. The warmth of the heater wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the freezing streets he had called home for too long. It felt strange, unnatural even, to be in a space so clean, so comfortable. He didn't belong here. David drove in silence for a while, giving Jacob time to process everything. The city lights blurred past them, casting shadows on the rain-slicked roads. Jacob kept glancing at his reflection in the side mirror. His face was unshaven, his cheeks hollow, his eyes tired. He looked every bit the homeless man he was. "This feels unreal," Jacob finally muttered. David smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Get used to it." Jacob huffed. Easier said than done. A few minutes later, they pulled up to a high-rise apartment complex on the better side of town. Jacob immediately tensed. The building was pristine, the kind of place he had only seen from a distance. David must have noticed his hesitation because he gave Jacob a reassuring nod. "Come on," he said. "It's just a place to stay, nothing more." Jacob swallowed his pride and followed David inside. The lobby alone was enough to make his stomach twist with discomfort. Polished floors, elegant lighting, people in expensive clothes. He pulled his coat tighter, painfully aware of how out of place he was. They stepped into an elevator, and David pressed the button for the 12th floor. As the doors slid shut, Jacob cleared his throat. "So, about this job," he said, trying to focus on something else. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" David glanced at him. "What can you do?" Jacob hesitated. It had been years since he had held a steady job. "I used to work in construction," he admitted, "before everything fell apart." David nodded as if considering something. "Then we'll start there." Jacob frowned. "Wait, you actually have a job for me? Just like that?" David shrugged. "Why not?" Jacob shook his head in disbelief. "You really are insane." David chuckled. "Maybe, but I believe in second chances." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into a hallway lined with elegant apartment doors. David led him to one at the end, unlocking it and pushing it open. Jacob stepped inside and froze. The apartment was modest but beautiful, clean, warm, filled with the scent of something faintly citrusy. There was a couch, a small kitchen, a bed with neatly folded sheets. To Jacob, it looked like a palace. David tossed a key onto the counter. "This is yours," he said simply. Jacob turned to him, his throat tight. "You're really doing this?" David nodded. "Yeah, and you're going to prove to me, and yourself, that it wasn't a mistake." Jacob looked around again, his vision blurring slightly. He had nothing when he woke up that morning. No hope, no future. Now, standing here, he realized something terrifying. He had a chance, and for the first time in years, he wasn't going to waste it. Jacob woke up in a real bed for the first time in years. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for reality to pull him back to the streets. But the warmth of the blanket, the soft mattress beneath him, and the faint hum of the heater told him this was real. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. A stranger, a billionaire no less, had given him a place to stay, a fresh start, and a job. It still didn't feel real. He half expected David to change his mind, to come knocking on the door and take it all back. But when Jacob walked into the small kitchen, he found a note on the counter instead. "Meet me at 9 a.m., David." Jacob glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:12 a.m. He exhaled sharply. He had a job to get to, a real job. For the first time in years, he had a purpose. By 9 a.m., Jacob stood outside a massive construction site, shifting awkwardly as men in hard hats moved around him. The air was thick with the smell of concrete and dust, the sound of drills and heavy machinery filling the air. David arrived a few minutes later, dressed in a sharp suit, standing out like a sore thumb among the workers. He grinned when he spotted Jacob. "Glad you made it," he said. Jacob stuffed his hands into the pockets of the clean clothes David had given him that morning, jeans and a thick jacket that actually fit. "Didn't really have an excuse not to," he muttered. David laughed. "Good answer." He gestured toward a group of workers. "Come on, I want you to meet someone." Jacob followed him to where an older man in a worn flannel shirt was checking blueprints. He had a thick mustache and an air of authority about him. "Jacob, this is Mike," David introduced. "Mike, meet Jacob. He's starting today." Mike looked Jacob up and down, his sharp eyes taking him in. Jacob tensed, waiting for the judgment, the doubt. But instead, Mike simply nodded. "You worked construction before?" he asked. Jacob nodded. "Yeah, it's been a while, but I know my way around a site." Mike grunted in approval. "Good, we could use another set of hands." He pointed toward a stack of wooden planks. "Think you can help with that?" Jacob nodded again, relief washing over him. "Yeah, I can do that." Mike clapped him on the back. "Then, let's get to work." As Jacob followed him toward the materials, he glanced back at David, who gave him a small nod before stepping away. Jacob took a deep breath and picked up the first plank. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was working toward something. The hours passed in a blur of sweat and hard labor. Jacob had forgotten what it felt like to be useful, to feel his muscles burn with effort, to work alongside other men with a common goal. He wasn't just another homeless guy begging for spare change. He was part of something again. Mike didn't go easy on him, but Jacob appreciated it. The older man barked orders, corrected his form, and pushed him to keep up. At first, Jacob worried he wouldn't be able to handle it. His body had grown weak from months of hunger, his hands soft from lack of use. But as the day went on, muscle memory kicked in. His arms lifted heavy planks. His legs carried him across the site. His instincts guided him through the controlled chaos of the build. By the time lunch rolled around, Jacob was drenched in sweat, his back aching, but he felt something he hadn't in years: pride. He sat on a stack of lumber, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket. The other workers chatted around him, some laughing, some eating in silence. Jacob kept his head down, unsure if he belonged in their circle just yet. Then, to his surprise, Mike sat beside him, handing him a sandwich wrapped in foil. Jacob blinked. "What's this?" "Lunch?" Mike grunted, biting into his own sandwich. Jacob hesitated. I didn't bring anything." Mike rolled his eyes. Yeah, I figured. Just eat. Jacob unwrapped the sandwich slowly. The smell alone made his stomach tighten with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the night before, too nervous that morning to think about food. He took a bite, chewing slowly, savoring every flavor. As he ate, one of the younger workers across from him spoke up. "So, how do you know David?" Jacob stiffened, glancing at Mike, but the older man didn't react. He helped me out," Jacob said carefully. The worker nodded, taking a sip of water. "Yeah, he does that a lot. Comes around, checks in on people, makes sure we're treated right. Not a lot of bosses do that." Jacob frowned. "He does this often," Mike chuckled. "David isn't your average billionaire. He's been through his own struggles." Jacob processed that, remembering the way David had spoken about second chances. There was more to his story. Jacob could feel it. But for now, he just focused on finishing his sandwich, listening to the conversation around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a nameless face in a crowd. He was part of something again, and that meant everything. As the workday came to an end, Jacob stood beside the site, stretching his sore muscles. His hands were raw. His legs felt like lead, but beneath the exhaustion there was something else. Satisfaction. He had earned his meal today. He had done something meaningful. Mike clapped him on the shoulder as he passed by. "Good first day, kid. You didn't collapse, so that's a good sign." Jacob let out a breathless chuckle. "Barely," Mike smirked. "Be here at 7 sharp tomorrow, and don't be late." Jacob nodded, watching as the workers packed up, heading home to families, warm meals, and lives he had almost forgotten people like him could have. He glanced toward the street and saw David leaning against his car, arms crossed, watching him. Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans before walking over. "You checking up on me?" David grinned. "Maybe." He opened the car door. "Come on, let's get you home." Home. The word still felt foreign. Jacob slid into the passenger seat, exhaling as the warmth of the heater hit him. His body ached in places he hadn't felt in years, but it was a good kind of pain. As David pulled onto the road, he glanced over. "So, how'd it feel?" Jacob ran a hand through his unkempt hair, staring out the window. "Hard, but good. I'd forgotten what it was like to work." David nodded. "Feels different when you know you're building something, doesn't it?" Jacob swallowed, his fingers tightening around his knee. "Yeah." He hesitated before adding, "Mike said you do this a lot, helping people." David's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "I try." Jacob turned to him. "Why?" David was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Because I was you once." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. David let out a slow sigh. "I wasn't born into money, Jacob. I was homeless once too. Lost everything. Spent nights sleeping under bridges, begging for change, thinking the world had forgotten me." Jacob stared at him, stunned. "One day, someone took a chance on me," David continued. "An old man who ran a small shop. He gave me a job, a place to stay, and a reason to believe in myself again." His lips curved into a small, almost sad smile. "I promised myself that if I ever got out, I'd do the same for someone else." Jacob felt a lump rise in his throat. "So, you think I can get out too?" he asked quietly. David turned to him at a red light, his expression steady. "I don't think, Jacob. I know." Jacob swallowed hard, looking down at his calloused hands. For the first time in years, he believed it too. The following weeks passed in a blur of hard work and quiet transformation. Jacob showed up at the construction site every morning at 7 sharp, rain or shine. The work was grueling, his body constantly sore, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was alive. More than that, he was rebuilding not just structures but himself. Mike took him under his wing, showing him the ropes again, pushing him when he started to doubt himself. The other workers slowly warmed up to him, and soon, he was part of the crew. They laughed, shared meals, and for the first time in years, Jacob felt like he belonged somewhere. Each evening, he returned to his apartment, a real home, a place he could lock the door and know he was safe. At first, he found it hard to sleep in a bed, the silence too foreign, too different from the constant noise of the streets. but slowly, night by night, he adjusted. David checked in on him regularly, sometimes dropping by the site, sometimes taking him out for coffee. Their conversations grew deeper, and Jacob started to see David as more than just a man who had saved him. He was a friend. One evening, after work, David invited Jacob to dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown. It was the kind of place Jacob would have never stepped into before. Warm lighting, polished wooden tables, and soft jazz playing in the background. He felt out of place, even in the clean clothes David had given him. As they sat down, David leaned forward with a knowing smile. "You're looking better." Jacob huffed a laugh. "I feel better." David studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, I think it's time we talk about the next step." Jacob tensed. "Next step?" David nodded. "You've got your job. You've got your place. But I don't want you to just survive, Jacob. I want you to thrive." Jacob frowned. "I don't understand." David leaned back, his expression serious. "I don't just want you to work construction forever, unless that's what you want. But you've got more potential than that. I can help you do something bigger, something that lasts." Jacob stared at him, heart pounding. "Like what?" David smiled. "Like building something of your own." Jacob swallowed hard. The idea felt impossible. He had spent so long just trying to make it through the day. The thought of reaching for something more, it scared him. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. David tilted his head. "You didn't think you could make it off the streets either. But look at you now." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he took a deep breath. "What do I have to do?" David grinned. "We start by figuring out what you want, not just to survive, but to live." Jacob exhaled slowly, nodding. For the first time in years, he was ready to dream again. The next few months were the hardest and most rewarding of Jacob's life. With David's guidance, he worked not just on construction, but on himself. He took classes, learned new skills, and for the first time in years, dared to imagine a future. And he vowed, deep in his heart, that one day he would do for someone else what David had done for him. Kindness changes lives. A single act of compassion can rewrite someone's story. If you've ever doubted the power of generosity, let Jacob's journey remind you, hope begins with a helping hand. Who can you lift today?